This is the first module, and I'm really excited about this, about being here in this location. Obviously, from New York, it's only about 15 miles from my house right here, but you're in kind of a whole different world, right? You're back in the 60s, and this is cool because I actually remember the 60s when, right, Mark? We know this, actually. We lived this, going through airports. My wife worked in Italy when she was in her 1920s and whatever, and she would come back here, and this is the airline that she would always use. And she would talk about how her mother, her father could actually, at those days, you could walk right up to the gate, right? You didn't have any security, you didn't have any, TSA or anything like that. And so people could walk literally right up to the gate with you and kiss you goodbye, and you get on a plane and you go. And she remembers walking through those halls of this airport with her mother and her father, and even the restaurant that we ate last night is basically the same exact restaurant that was here. So, this hotel is a landmark because the architect is a very famous architect, and so they could not tear it down. So that's one of the reasons why they converted it into a hotel, which is pretty cool. So I hope you enjoy when you're here, or staying here, get it. There is I don't know if you saw, there's a twister room. So at some point, we're going to have a twister party, right? So, whenever we do courses, and when I do courses, we kind of become like a family at the end, all right? So it's a very close-knit group that we have. This is very particular information, too intense for most people, to be honest. It's a little bit too much, especially these days. Peter and I was talking about everybody just wants to learn an app. Just give me an app that I can use, that I can work with a patient. I don't want to really understand why it works or how it works or if it works at all or if there's any research to support anything. That's not what we do, right? What we're going to do here is it's, all research-based. One of the things that Peter Schreier, who really has been incredibly helpful in the organization of this course, to make it really the most, I think, organized course that I've ever done as far as really the way we've designed it to lead you along the way here, really with looking at brain development from every aspect, but not, in just understanding, but from a practical way. We have Dr. Tina, who's a great pediatrician from Slovenia that's here, and she's going to go through some stuff tomorrow on working with small babies and looking at motor development and hypotonia, and you may not work with babies, you may have no interest in working with babies, but when you see what she's going to go through and it connects with the next step of what I do, it gives you this idea that in your head every patient was a baby, right? Every patient started out that way, and if they start out with low tone, if they start out not being able to roll over, if they don't hit their milestones, if they have tongue ties or they can't latch on, this matters. For the rest of their life, it matters. And that's the point. That's the point of what we're doing here, is that this isn't just about, working with kids. This is about the story of everybody's brain, the story of a patient's brain. And that should fascinate you, right? That should make you, when a person walks in, you should think, they're telling me whatever it is, I got in a car accident, or, I started getting dizzy yesterday, or, I'm depressed, or I've been diagnosed with bipolar, whatever it may be, an autoimmune disorder. You look at them and you can say, okay, when did this start? Oh, it happened to started about 3 months ago. In your mind, though, you need to think, what's this person's story of their brain? How did it start? What was the beginning? I always loved comic books and things like that, and one of my favorite things is the origin stories, right? Where did it come from? That's one of the reasons why the first book I wrote started with evolution of the brain, the ultimate origin story of all of us. How did we originate? How did brains begin on the planet? Why did they begin? And it turns out that it's really because of movement and motor development and motor activity. And so, like, Tina's going to go through some stuff about that, and it's going to be, you're going to see the origin of everybody. And you can see that, wow, this can go wrong very easily, And when it does, the whole trajectory of that person's life is altered. And that's what we get to do. We get to change the trajectory of somebody's life, no matter what age they're at. We can change it. But when you work with a small child or a young kid and you change their developmental trajectory, go from a kid that may never speak their whole life to a child that can speak, to an adult that actually, may have a really great life. And this is what we're doing, right? This is the point of what we're doing. So, most of you, I think, are here, my history. But what we're going to try to do in this course more than ever before is really bring in my research, right? My papers. Peter has been, really great with looking at organizing a lot of my papers. We've given you a lot of papers. And we've given you a folder with some of the papers that I've most recently written, but some of the older papers as well. But, I have a pretty good history of papers at this point in time. We've published, I guess, I think 5 or 6 papers in just the last 8 months or so. And now we're actually going to start coming out with actual original data that is going to come out about the research that we've done. So we're going to kind of use that as a historical and kind of use my papers as we go along. Again, I want to thank you all for being here. I know this is a sacrifice. This hotel is cool, but may not be the easiest to get to in some cases, and it might be a little bit more expensive for some people. But I always respect that it's a sacrifice, that you sacrifice your time and your money and your family to be able to come here and learn. And you're doing that for one reason, that you want to become better at what you do, right? Because when you go back home, nobody's going to be there having a parade for you, right? The insurance companies aren't going to say, hey, guess what? You're going to give you $100 more a patient, You're not making more money doing it per se, even though we're going to show you in ways that obviously you should, and we're going to talk about that. So, again, I just want to thank you all for being here so much. It means a lot to me. This, right now, is my plan the last time to do this course live for me. There may be others that will carry that on. We're recording it. We have a great recording team back here that we've worked with for many years. And again, I want to thank you. The person I want to thank more than anybody else, though, is Janet Groeschel, who's in the back there. She's actually, just imagine, she's actually been working with me for 27, almost 28 years. Someone can stand me that long, besides my wife, right? And but she has been without, I was just talking to Peter, and without her, I don't know where I'd be in any of this. So, I love her. She's great. She's part of my family. Again, if you get a chance, most of you have interacted with her. You can thank her yourself because, all of this is because of her. This quote, I think, is so appropriate for this time. Do not be dismayed by the brokenness of the world. All things break, and all things can be mended. Not with time, as they say, but with intention. So go, love intentionally, extravagantly, unconditionally. The broken world awaits in darkness for the light that is you. I think, we live in a world that seems to be pretty broken right now, right? And I'm going to talk about different authors that I like. And Ian McGilchrist is a psychiatrist out of the UK. You may have seen him lately. He's been in a lot of podcasts and talking with different people. He wrote a book a few years ago called The Master and His Emissary, the Western Development of the Western World and the Divided Brain. And it was all about brain asymmetry and its relationship to psychiatric conditions. But he takes a philosophical approach. And he just came out with 2 other 800-page volumes. And his book is, especially the asymmetry book, is very similar. He used many, many, many of the same references that I use in my textbook. And he talks about more philosophically how we've been moving towards a left brain dominant type of world, and that the right brain is really the master, right? The right brain does everything. The right brain is moral, it's ethical, it's love, it's empathy, it's connection to other people, it's connected to ourselves, it's connected to the real world around us. And, thank you. It's okay. Thank you. It is what kind of should be guiding us. And obviously in ancient humans, it probably was the more dominant hemisphere. It's nonverbal. It doesn't have a language. It doesn't speak. It just gives you intuition and gut feelings. The left brain is very isolated. It basically looks at the world as a virtual image. It's separated from other people, and it's really disconnected from our body. It doesn't really have a lot of emotions, and the only primary emotions that they have really is happiness, pride, and anger, especially anger. Anger is actually the only emotion that the left brain has that the right brain doesn't have. And we look at the left brain being very goal-directed. It's very individualistic. It's motivated by acquiring things, seeking behavior, consumatory behavior. And so we see that the world is moving that way even more, especially with technology driving it that way. And we see a divided world. We see more anger, right? Now, the thing about McGilchrist's work, like other people, he's very eloquent when he speaks and when he writes. He's a researcher. He's from Cambridge. But he doesn't have a solution for it. He has no solution, right? There's nothing other than awareness of it. He understands, schizophrenia is a right brain deficit, or he understands all of those things, but he doesn't have a solution. What we're going to give you is the best solution that's ever been developed. And it's now proven with the research that we're doing. We do it every day. My staff is here, so again, feel free to ask them if I say anything and you doubt that I'm saying it, that we actually do it. We do it, okay? And we see the results, and you will too. And that's what we want to give you. We want to give you everything. We want to give you all the answers and everything. Obviously, there are some books that I've written, and most of them, Peter will talk probably even more than me about how to actually use these books. They're tools, right? I wrote them to make your job easier and to make a parent's job easier. That's why I wrote them, right? I also wrote them so I didn't have to keep on saying the same thing over and over and over again, which is also a help for you, right? Because that explanation that you give to people, why things happen, is so important. It's so important to the patient. It's so important to your practice. It can be the difference between a patient being, loving you and thinking you're the greatest thing in the world, or actually thinking that you don't know what you're doing and, losing all faith. How you explain things, understanding it, especially the idea of brain asymmetry and how that plays a role in symptoms and behaviors and how that changes as the brain changes, as we work. And these books are all tools that are in there that help you to really, the way I speak to patients, again, was what I do all day, every day for the most part. It's taken 30 years to get here. And I'm constantly refining it and changing it and trying to get it better and give easier ways of explaining it. And these books, pretty much embody that. So you can get 30 years of how to speak to people about it, how to describe it to them. It's really a very, very important part of your treatment to really let people know this is what's going to happen. This is why this is happening, right? Expect these changes when. And it is hugely important. My staff will tell you all the time, I'm telling them, we got to talk to people. We got to explain to them while you're treating them, talk to them, educate them. The education process is hugely important. That's why you have to know it. You have to understand it. The more you know something, the easier it is to explain it in simple terms. It's one of the reasons why I still teach, because it helps me refine and make the most complex things understandable. That's my goal, to be able to do that more and more. So these are all tools that you can use. I don't know if you know, another tool that we developed, my wife and I, is a show called Disconnected Kids, Reconnected Families. It's a web series that we filmed a few years ago as a way of introducing people to some of the centers and also being able to talk about what you need to do at home. Because in this day and age, especially, home programming is hugely important, especially if you're working virtually with people, right? That's all it is home programming. But the biggest complaints I hear when people come in that have been to other centers that, they think kind of looks like ours or whatever, unless the person has actually really done our course and followed it, is that they don't have any follow-up, right? They go there, maybe do an intensive for 5 days or whatever, or more, and then they leave, and there's very little follow-up. And that is, a big, big mistake, right? Because that frequency, being able to do that over and over, is really the key, because they're going to be doing more at home than they are in your office in any case. Even if they're coming in, they're doing intensives twice a day, whatever, they're going to go sometime back home, or they're going to be focused on a home program. So we developed this TV show to really do that, and now it's on a streaming network called My Home TV, and it's #1. I mean, we have almost 1 million views in less than 3 months, which is kind of shocking to all of us, to be honest with you, but it's a great tool, and it's something that also we find that if you show it to families, with a little bit of a warning, because it's a little bit raw, and these families are really, really need a lot of help, and it's not going to be indicative. So you don't want to insult your family and go, "Hey, you're like this family, and you have animal hair all over your wall." But anyway, it's another great tool there. So with this course, we always start with some goals, and the first thing is that this is a fellowship certification level course. What does that mean? Well, you go to college, you get a college degree. Then you go to graduate school and get some sort of professional degree in healthcare, an MD, a DC, a PhD, an OT, a PT, a nurse practitioner, whatever it may be. And then beyond that is a fellowship. So it's one of the highest degrees that anybody can ever attain. What does that mean? It means you have to treat it that way. This isn't just some kind of weekend seminar that you go to and you sit back and you get your hours, right? This is a fellowship course, which means it takes work. It means you're expected to study in between. When I give you papers, I expect you to read those papers, right? And for reading papers, especially on experimental data, it doesn't have to be long. You read the introduction and the discussion, and then go to the discussion and results, right? You don't have to go through all of the methods and methodologies and everything. But expect you to read it, and if we send you any videos, how many people? And again, be honest, and we're not gonna try to make you feel bad or anything like that. But how many people had a chance to look at the 3-hour neuroanatomy book video? Okay, good. Did you find that helpful? That's one of the things we wanted to do, because give you a foundation. And you can watch that over and over, because as the course goes on, we're still going to build neuroanatomy, but that's kind of the foundation of it. And that's going to be important, right? It's going to be like when I come in here and I say, what are the 5 loops, primary loops of the basal ganglia and what they do? And, I ask that question and nobody raises their hand or nobody answers, then we know that you're really not working in between, right? This last testing that we had, people struggled with some of it. And the reason is I can tell you that when we were there and doing the course, people weren't doing work in between. They just weren't. So, that's what you're expected to put the time in to study. You're being trained to become one of the top experts in the world in functional developmental behavioral neuroimmunology, which to me really encompasses the ultimate version of healthcare, right? The ultimate version of healthcare, not just, working with kids with ADHD or something like that. This is the immunology that we're going to get into, and connecting it to the brain and the nervous system. Our goal for Peter and I, and anybody else like Dr. Carlo, who's here from Australia, came here, and you're going to get to hear him today, and he's amazing, is to connect these things in a way that nobody's ever really done it before, that we've never done it before. This is kind of like the leading edge of everything. And it's going to be fascinating, but it's pretty complex stuff. If you're going to become one of the best in the world at what you do, you need to really expect it to work, okay? So now we are going to work even better to organize this as for the test and prepare you for the test, because we want you all to be certified, because the world needs you out there. Janet can tell you we get inundated with people all around the world and in the United States now that are looking for people that are trained in this. More and more and more. And that's going to come out even more because we have some really big things happening in the next month or two. And we need that. But we can't refer people if they're not really fully trained, okay? And there are some other requirements for the fellowship that will be explained. There's some other hours that you might need to get. But, again, to be able to be at the level that we're going to train you, it takes some work. And our goal is to give you all the tools, right? Not just the clinical tools, but also talk about personal development, business, all of that. So some of you have obviously heard this before. Some of you have not, but it's always a good thing to talk about. How many people in this room, thinking back on your life, can say that, you had a personal relationship in some way with somebody that was truly great at what they do, meaning one of the best in the world at what they do, right? Think back, and I'm not talking about you met someone once or it was your father's friend, or talking about that you really kind of interacted with on a regular basis. How many people know somebody like that or had somebody like that in their life? Okay. So you look around and, it's not a lot. And actually that's more than most rooms, right? How many of those people that raised their hand had more than one person that they knew like that? Okay, 4, 5. Okay. So that's kind of unusual, right? It's rare. Why aren't there more people like that? And, also, why is that important? Is it important? Do you have to be great? We live in a world, I just read an article by a psychologist that was basically saying, tell your kids to have lower expectations, and that's how they become happy. Literally, this was just lower their expectations. Tell them not to want a lot, and then they'll be happy. Because a lot of their unhappiness is because, they want things, and they're never going to have them, right? That was actually the article. And I was like, wow, this is the message, right? So of those people, the 5 people that raised their hand that had, or any of you that raised your hand, how many of you had somebody who was a family member? Who was it, Rodrigo?
My grandfather.
Your grandfather. What did he do? So why should you worry about being great or doing anything, right? That's one reason. Imagine that your child, your kid, your son, your daughter is sitting in a room someday and somebody like me asks that question. And they raise their hand and they say, it was my mother, my father. That was my example in life, right? You want them to want everything. If I asked any of you what you want for your kids, it's going to be you want them to be happy and healthy and have a great relationship. And one of the things that you would absolutely say is I want them to find work that they're passionate about, that they love, right? Not just some job that they don't have to work very hard at and that they're going to be bored at for the rest of their life, but something that they really drives them, right? If I gave you a choice with your child, how many of you would choose to try to push your child towards something that they love and is passionate, or something that's safe and they would make a lot of money, right? How many people would choose the passion side? Right. How many people would choose the safe money side? Okay, so that's what we want for them. But where do you think they get that from? They need examples in their life. And you should be that example. And you are. By being here, by doing this, this is exactly how you set that example. Because you're not just talking about it. You're not just sitting on the couch saying, hey, you should go exercise. You're actually embodying it. And that's the point. Because, I think when we look at life and we look at why we're here, it's how much value you're going to add while you're here, right? Are you going to make a difference? Did it matter that you were here? And when you talk about making a difference or adding value, there's different ways to do that, right? And your income and what you do and how much money you make is really a measurement in many ways of the value that you've added. And that may sound like, well, you know, there's more value than some money, but money is actually a great measuring stick. And there are a lot of people that make money because they've added value to a lot of people in small ways, you know, some companies or, you know, like Facebook or something like that, right? As a doctor, as a therapist, you add value in ways that nobody else can really add, but you also want to do it to a lot of people, right? We want to be able to show you how to improve your practice, bring more people in so that you can actually help more people, because it really comes down to, you know, what you get in life is really equal to the value that you add to the amount of people that you add. That's it. So the more value you can add to people, to the world, is, you know, really directly related to the value that you get in return in your life. So those are the reasons why I think it's important to strive to be really good and be one of the best at what you do. Like I said, I think that this course represents the future of healthcare. It's not just, again, a course working with kids or, you know, ADHD or autism. It goes way beyond that. What we're really talking about in this course is, I think, the essence of health, mental health, physical health, spiritual health. And again, the more I go down the road, the more we do research, the more I understand the value of early development of a brain. It is hugely important. And it goes awry more often than we would imagine. And even little things that can go off the rails, you know, when a child's 3 months old or 5 months old or 6 months old or a year, you know, has incredible impact 20, 30 years down the road, 40 years down the road. And we're going to, you know, talk about how that population is the same population. And it's about the brain. And the brain controls everything. Everything. And, you know, still most people don't know that. Most practitioners don't know that. You know, people that may be experts in immunology have no idea that the nervous system actually plays the leading role. So you're working with a system that's hugely important, like the immune system, you know, inflammation, autoimmune issues, chronic infections, and it's complicated. And Peter's going to go through it in ways that, you know, is going to be understandable, but really also in ways that very few people in the world really understand. And we're going to talk about how the brain interacts with that and regulates that, and the nervous system. And there are very, very few people out there that understand that. And when you do understand it, you say, okay, so the brain is the boss. So the immune system, even if I'm working with directly, if I'm not dealing with the main issue, then am I really doing anything? Or am I really going to do anything that's going to have real long-term impact? So for me, the future of healthcare is about assessment and treatment, and that the brain focuses on specific functional neuroanatomy. That's why, you know, I did the neuroanatomy review, because, again, to really understand the brain, you need to understand neuroanatomy. And again, I would venture to say that all of you should be experts in neuroanatomy by the end of this. We'll give you whatever tools you need. We can record some more advanced neuroanatomy videos. You do know that I also have a course on really advanced functional neuroanatomy, you know, that you can all have access to. I made these slides a while back, just trying to describe what parents really see, what patients really see. You know, the old story of the blind man and the elephant is an old story from India. And there were these 5 blind men, and they lived in a village, and they always heard of the mighty elephant. None of them obviously could see, so they didn't know what an elephant looked like. But they wanted to go to an elephant so they could each examine the elephant and get a sense of what an elephant actually looks like. So they were taken to an elephant, and they all got off and went on, and they walked up to the elephant, and each grabbed a piece of the elephant. You know, one grabbed the tail and said, oh, an elephant looks like a rope. And the other, you know, touched the tusk and said, an elephant looks like a spear. And another one, you know, touched the ear and said, it looks like a fan. And one touched the side and said, it looks like a wall. The other one grabbed the leg and said, it looks like a tree. So after they had examined the elephant for themselves, they all went back to the village. And when they got back, they started talking to each other about what the elephant looked like. And they realized that they had different versions. And They argued with one another for the rest of their lives because they were absolutely sure that they were right because they had examined the elephant themselves and knew that this piece represented the whole thing. And so when we look at the world of healthcare out there, parents, patients, they, will go somewhere and someone will say, well, it's the immune system. And someone will go and say, it's all academic or neuropsychological. And other people will look at it and say, it's the gut. And the gut is the key to everything. And, other people will look at and say, well, it's really all about the motor system and sensory system. Or it's all biochemical and it's all neurotransmitters, or it's all, heavy metals. And most of those practitioners have one perspective. They're only seeing one part of the elephant. And they don't see the whole thing, even if they're really expert in that. George Bernard Shaw said at one point, many, many years ago, that doctors are getting more and more specialized. And he said pretty soon, they're so specialized that we'll have, some doctors that know everything about nothing, right? And the answer is the elephant is the brain, right? The elephant is the whole brain. The brain is what regulates all of those different systems. If there's dysregulation in the immune system, more often than not, it is a brain problem. And more often than not, it started in childhood, during development. And that's the thought I want you to get in your head all along and understand that this is part of your explanation. The environment plays a role. Genetics play a role, of course. We're going to talk about that in a big way. So, what we're doing, what we're training you is what we call the Melillo Method. This is obviously, what we look at is a clinical treatment model based on developmental functional neuroscience and neuroanatomy that emphasizes brain-based model of health, right? So the first line there, I'm not saying that it's about pediatrics or it's about children or it's about any specific condition. This is about healthcare as a whole. It utilizes co-activation of multiple modalities, including cutting-edge brain stimulation tools to restore functional connectivity to the brain, promote hemispheric integration. So again, right there is kind of the essence and core of what we're trying to do. We're trying to change functional connectivity in the brain. We're going to target specific networks and specific areas of the brain to promote integration, especially between the hemispheres. To me, that is the single most important thing you can do in healthcare. But we need to understand that we need to integrate retained primitive reflexes to promote bottom-up development. It's a key component of this approach because you can't just go to the brain if the foundation isn't built. We have to remove what's called bottom-up interference. You'll hear that phrase over and over and again. You should get used to using that phrase. When there is anything that interferes with development of the brain, it causes what we call bottom-up interference, and it delays bottom-up completion. The brain has to complete its bottom-up development before it can actually come down and regulate everything the way it's supposed to regulating it. So by removing this bottom-up interference and stimulating underactive networks on one side of the brain, this leads to hemispheric integration and ultimately proper top-down regulation of the whole body, eliminates symptoms and restores function. And that's what we're doing. So it's really a model of how to do this. There are, specific steps that we're going to teach you, specific tools we're going to teach you, and give you hands-on training in it. But it also is about the concept. This is an article from March of 2022. And in this article, basically the idea was that, for years, people said, well, there isn't enough research in autism. And so organizations got together and they did promote, raising money and doing some research. And even though most of that research was geared towards looking at genetics, which is looking for a gene mutation, which they're never going to find and never have found, they, are looking at that research. But what's not happening is it's not being translated into treatment. It's not being translated into making an impact and making a difference in this population. And one of the populations that, I'm most excited about working with, and you may or may not, but we'll give you the tools to do it, is really the non-speaking autism world. It's a fascinating thing. It's very difficult, obviously, for families. This is probably the majority of what we work with in our center. And we get, great results, really, really great results. They're difficult to work with in many ways. Some of them are probably the most challenging patients you'll ever have. But we have developed a way of really working with that consistently. Like I said, my staff, anything walks in that door, they are not fazed, right? They're like, okay, bring it on, let's go. A 25-year-old guy that's, 230 pounds that's not speaking and is going to try to punch you in the face, we'll work with him. And within a few days, we'll change that, right? So, in this person was complaining that we're not seeing any treatments from this research. It's not translating into what we do. And that's important. This was Gabriel. Gabriel worked with us for a little while. Gabriel was a young kid when I first started working with him. He's about 5 or 6 years old. He was non-speaking. And so his mother reached out to me a couple of summers ago and said, Gabriel's doing great. He still remembers you. He talks about you. I said, how's he doing? Here he is 15 years later. She said, he's doing great. You'd be so proud of him and what he's done. And he graduated high school and, now he's at home and he took care of his grandmother when she had Alzheimer's and she was dying. And I said, I'd love to meet him. So he came to the office. I met him, talked to him. And he's great young man. I mean, clearly still autistic, but, highly functional. And incredible artist, actually. And so I said, what's your goals? What do you want? He said, I want to get a job. I want to drive a car. I want to live by myself, right? Great, right? That's fantastic. So when I opened my new center, I reached out to the mom and I said, listen, I want to get Gabriel a job. We don't care what he really does. We'll show him some things, but I think it would be great and it would be inspirational for the other parents that come in and see kids and they're like, if my son could become like this, I'll be all right, And so he came in, and this is a picture of the first day he got his first check. And he was like, Mom, I got a job. And just a great story for him. It was just kind of the full circle, right? And that's kind of representative of what I wish for you guys to experience. We're going to present a lot of research. This is my research team. They're all neurologists, medical neurologists in Cuba, except for Jerry Leisman, who's neuropsychology. Both have PhDs also in electrophysiology. Calixto Machado, the heavyset man there, is one of the leading experts in the world in QEEG. Been doing it since the early 90s, and he's just amazing, has over 500 publications. Jerry Leisman, my main research partner in the middle, also has over 500 publications, and he's also has a PhD in electrophysiology. And it's just, they're an incredible team. And we'll be presenting a lot of that research. So, we start with what we call the brain developmental blueprint. There's a blueprint to the brain. Right now we live in a world, again, where, everything is kind of just, we're told to just accept everything and that, anything can be variable. And a lot of what we're being told now about brain development from people is that, well, it doesn't matter. It can go any way. It's all variable, and there's all different ways that people can develop their brain and move and crawl and hit milestones. And I completely disagree with that. There's actually a pretty strict model, I believe, in the way the brain develops. And it needs to follow those steps. And it's pretty narrow. Within a month or two, if they're off, it matters for the rest of their life. So this blueprint is very specific. And, you'll go out there and people are now trying to tell you that's not the case. And so also when you're examining somebody, as we said, you need to think of it from that perspective. No matter what age of the patient, whether they're, 7 or 70, you have to think about, again, what's the story of this person's brain, right? That's what I want you to think about. And I think, as a story, it kind of makes you interesting because to me, I love the stories of each family. What they go through, the sacrifices they make, the difficulties. but it's their story. And it's beautiful. And you have a chance of changing that story in a way that nobody else can. There's a basic blueprint, like I said, to all brain development, and that blueprint must progress in the right stages at the right time. It will never self-correct, right? So generally, when the brain kind of goes off its tracks, it will never self-correct, and it needs somebody to be able to intervene. You need to go back to the point of where that divergence happened. Now, again, when you're talking about a history of a patient, and again, I've given you all of the forms, and we'll talk about them, about what we use in our office, history forms, checklists, sensory checklists, hemispheric checklists, most of which I created myself, but we've been using for over 20 years, and they're really very accurate. And, that gives you a really good window. But, let's face it, a lot of people don't know or aren't going to remember what their first year of life was like. Did they crawl? Did they roll over? Did they have low tone? Were they breastfed? Did they crawl in a proper way, or did they crawl in an unusual way? They may not know that. So we have to have other ways of going back and saying, is this a problem? You have a child that comes in and they have behavioral issues, or they have immune issues, or they have a lot of things going on. First of all, the more things they have going on, the more likely the brain is the culprit, because that's the one thing that connects everything. But, is this more psychological? Is this behavioral? Is it neurological? Because what we want to work with really is the neurological piece, right? You have psychologists that can deal with family therapy and psychology, and that's fine. They do a great job. But we want to deal with the neurological issues. And so there are ways to look at that, that we're going to go through. Primitive reflexes being retained is probably the number one thing that we're going to see, as well as if there's any, obviously, imbalances, and if there's delays in things like, dominance profile. So there are ways, and part of the examination, and that's true in everybody. If you have an adult and they have all these retained primitive reflexes, it means that they've had issues since they were born. And whatever is in front of you is really somehow related to that. There may be other factors the longer they go in life, but the bottom line is, whatever you're seeing in front of you, if there are retained reflexes, it goes back to that. And when you change that, the difference is really phenomenal. There's a way that we examine people, and there's a way that we progress. There are steps and stages. And even though they're kind of a little bit somewhat parallel, they're also different. So, one of the first things we look at any patient is tone and symmetry. What does their muscle tone look like? What is the symmetry of that tone? Simple things like, differences in facial tone. A little bit less on one side versus the other is an unbelievable window into the person's everything. It's a window into their brainstem, which is where we're going to focus a lot of our neuroanatomy this weekend, is really, again, starting from the bottom up. We're going to start with really building this. We're going to build this story of the brain in a way that we've not done before, but from a practical perspective. And then primitive reflexes. Again, are they there? Are they there when they're supposed to be? Are they not there? And then what about their posture, their core, the big muscles, rolling over, crawling, gross motor strength and tone, the dominance profile, right hand, right eye, right ear. That's a real thing. Some people will be like, well, it doesn't matter, or is it really real? We're going to present some really cool research. We wrote a paper on this, on looking at the asymmetry of the brain from an evolutionary perspective, that just got published a couple of months ago. And it was really talking about, that there is this asymmetry that goes back 500 million years that we can document. In the first brains were asymmetric. And then also how that relates to an actual dominance profile, and how that relates to the way the brain shifts during human development, which is the key to building the right and left brain. Movement, sensory feedback, and the fact that the brain shifts from right in the first 3 years to left in the next 3 years is what builds the foundation of the hemispheres. And, again, there are a lot of people out there that, poo-poo the whole hemispheric model and whether it's important or not. It is hugely important. It is the most important thing. And it really was an unbelievably brilliant solution in evolution, the way it created this asymmetry in the brain. Because without that, we wouldn't be here. Without that, we wouldn't be able to do anything of what we do. And if something affects that, that translates into some difficulties in behavior, cognition, and it starts out really as a motor problem. The autonomic system develops. So again, all of these systems, we're going to talk about the development of it, right? And how they develop. And then the vestibular system, hugely important. Dr. Carlo Ronaldo from Australia is a PhD in vestibular system, trained with some of the best people in the world. You're going to see him today. He's going to be here a few times. But you couldn't learn how to be able to really look at the vestibular system better than somebody from him, because he's also, a functional neurologist and clinician, and he does it every day, and he uses it. So the vestibular system is hugely important, how it builds a map of our body, how we become embodied and know where we are in space, which we're going to talk about how hugely important that is, especially in something like autism. The optokinetic reflexes, the eye movements. So we have, we start with basic tone, symmetry, rolling over, core, dominance profile. Then we get into, building the vestibular system. As we start crawling and get more complex movement, we need more complex feedback. And then we eventually stand up, which puts a tremendous amount of input into this vestibular system, into our spine, bombards our brain. No other animal does that, right? And the optokinetic, to be able to keep level so that, if you're standing upright, you can't be tilted. You have to be straight. You have to see the world the way it is. You can't see the world tilted one way or the other. And that's building the eyes and eye movement on top of that. And then the brain builds. The brain ultimately comes from the back to the front, from the sensory part to the motor part, and then we get cognition and executive function that literally grows out of that, social behavior. And it literally grows out of the motor cortex, grows from it, right? So there was years ago, even now, there's some people, but they were like, well, motor has nothing to do with cognition. It's, there's no, what are you looking at? This person has mental health issues, so why are you looking at their movement? Because their mental health issues are an extension of movement. It grew out of the motor cortex, or it didn't grow. And that's the problem. And again, these are some of the tools that we have that nobody else really understands. When we look at brain development, obviously it starts with the neuron. In the neuroanatomy, I went through the basic neuron theory, potassium, sodium channels, and looking at, polarization, depolarization, hyperpolarization, how we create signals in the brain, which is ultimately, that's the language, right? It's the firing frequency. It all comes down to frequency. How fast do neurons fire? That's the signal. And we're learning more and more about how specific that is. And the groups of neurons and how they come together. So, first we see a neuron will grow, right? We're born with all the neurons we're ever going to have. And then we actually lose up to half of them during development in something called synaptic stabilization, where as neurons start firing together, some of them become overwhelmed and die, and the stronger ones survive. So it's actually called neural Darwinism, where the strongest neurons and the strongest connections are designed to survive that growth process. And then from there, they build more connections. And they start to segregate into connections with other neurons that do the same job that they're going to do. Then they grow within that network, and then they have to be able to integrate between networks. And ultimately, the ultimate network integration is between the two hemispheres. when we look at the development of the person and the child, we're looking at this. When we look at tone and symmetry, if there's asymmetry from the time they're born, there's an issue, right? If we can look at that, if they have trouble with tone, if they can't roll over, if they do it in an unusual way. Even, many of these reflexes are designed to help them get out of the womb. If there's difficulty getting out of the womb from the beginning, there are issues. I just came back from Croatia and did a really great seminar with Dr. Steve Williams. He's probably the best in the world in craniopathy, a chiropractor who was focused on pediatrics, especially babies, but looking at the movement of the skull bones, how important it is, and how we can change that, but how that can be affected during the birth process. Any baby that is kind of hung up in the womb is probably going to have some difficulty with their neck and with their skull bones and the movement of that. And so, little subtle things to be able to change that is important. But to look at it. So there's a lot of things that can happen from the very beginning. And looking at, are they proceeding in their milestones? What is their, do they have proper core? Do they have proper balance? Can they lift their head up? And then looking at, again, the vestibular system, even in small babies, looking at their eye movements. And we're looking at the development of these different stages of the brain. And then we have our exam procedures. There's actually 3 different exams we're going to teach you. And it's exactly what we do in our office. One level is for the lowest level. The small babies, the infants. We're going to go through that this weekend. And then we're going to talk about, really lower functioning at any age. Whether, if they're non-speaking and they can't answer questions, they're going to be fighting you the whole time. There's, an exam. We've got to focus on specific things that we're going to look at. But then there's, an adult that comes in with bipolar disorder and they can do everything. And they have a complex history and they need a complex exam. So we have that exam as well, right? So you have this menu of this exam to follow. And anybody that's taken my course will tell you that, people say, where do I start? Start with the exam. You start with this exam. You just follow it along, right? And we're going to teach you step by step by step just to go through it. And then that translates into treatment. You shouldn't examine really anything that you can't then influence, right? Somebody has, if you're measuring their lung capacity and it's low, what are you going to do about it? Now, that may be integrated with everything else, and it may be because of a mechanical problem in their body or their ribs, or it may be because they're very immature in their brain, or it may be that their brainstem isn't neurologically regulating it the way it should because those nuclei didn't develop in the medulla. But either way, what are you going to do about that treatment, and how are you going to actually do something to improve their breathing or their pulse or change that, their blood pressure, their vestibular system? Everything should translate into some sort of practical treatment, and those treatments need to have levels to them, right? Because you're going to progress this person along. And so we want to make sure that they're changing, they're growing, right? So these are ultimately what we're going to teach you. Again, we got to recognize that everything is developing at the same time. So we're looking at the motor system and sensory system, but we're also measuring their pulse rate, their respiratory rate. We're getting a window into their autonomic development. When we talk about people have gut problems or that gut is the key, where does that come from? One of the things I want you to always think of is whenever there's a problem and, people say, well, this population has this, or, we see that they have this B12 deficiency or whatever it is, the question should be why? Why? What's the source? And more often than not, comes down to the brain. The autonomic system is out of balance. Everything, all bets are off, right? Parasympathetic system doesn't develop. It's going to affect somebody in multiple ways for their whole life. And most people, almost every patient that we deal with, has some sort of dysregulation of their autonomic system. They have gut problems. And most of them have been to people that have done really good work on working on healing their gut. You can't heal the gut if their brainstem doesn't work. So looking at reflexes is a window into that on every aspect. Again, the autonomic system in the brain, everything is integrated with the immune system in more ways than anybody has known. And how that works, how that integration works, especially how that top-down regulation is supposed to work, is really huge, and that's something we're going to spend a lot of time on. But again, there are tools to intervene. Vitamins, minerals, amino acids, toxins, inflammation, looking at their DNA and if they have certain SNPs or, nucleotides that may give them some potential weaknesses. And these are forms that you should have all gotten. If you haven't received them, we will go through them in different stages as we lead you through the adult history form, the childhood history form, cognitive style profile, which is a profile that's designed to say, are you more right hemisphere or left hemisphere dominant? We're going to talk about traits. Most of the patients that we work with do not have genetic mutations, but they have genetic traits that may leave them susceptible. And those traits come from their parents or, from their family. Understanding that is really important. ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, we'll talk about that, how hugely important that is. People that have, been somewhat traumatized or been exposed to different things from the time they're children, and it alters their brain development. And again, whether it was caused by something like that or whether it was just, another thing like a birth issue or they couldn't, there was a problem with their tone from the beginning, whatever it is, it results in the same thing, delayed neural development. Sensory checklist, the adult hemispheric checklist, so that do they have a right hemisphere or left hemisphere deficit? We have a primitive reflex checklist that you can use, and especially virtually. People can fill it out if they can't test their own reflexes. The exam form. And like I said, we have different levels of exams, but you're going to get, you have the exam form, which is really an instruction manual to how to examine everybody. And then from there, there's a menu of treatments. What treatment options do you have? You can add anything that you want, that you're comfortable with, but we've given you options, and we'll talk about how to be able to use that. So this was the first paper I wrote on primitive reflexes, their relationship to delayed cortical maturation, underconnectivity, functional disconnection in childhood. And now my whole doctoral program has been based on that and looking at, in particular, autism. Why autism? I think most people would agree it's probably the most complex, mysterious issue there is in all of neuroscience. It's a spectrum because there are very different variations of it. And the most severe variations are really very severe and very limiting. People can't speak. But it's fascinating because we're going to show you that we work with something called RPM, which is a way of having kids that non-speaking can actually start to type out what's actually going on in their head. And it's unbelievable. They're geniuses, every single one of them. And how does that happen? How do you have a kid that has these genius level skills but can't do basic functions like go to the bathroom? And one of the things I can tell you is that every single patient that comes in, I say to them, you've been all over the world, you've seen some of the best people. Has anybody tried to explain to you what's happening in your child's brain? And every single one of them looks, no, not at all. No matter what it is, whether it's anything. Adults too. And when you think about it from that perspective, and you say it sounds so simple. What's happening in the brain? And they look like, yeah, why didn't anybody talk about that before? Right? And then what's our goal? To change that. To actually change that issue in the brain. It's really simple as that. But those two simple things are just, to most people, blow their mind, because it's like nobody's ever said that before. And that's our goal. That's what we want. And we want you guys to do that. And that's a really important thing to say to patients when they come in. Has anybody ever tried to explain this to you? And we just published a paper about 3 weeks ago, and it's probably the best paper I've written, on the advanced neuroanatomy of autism. What actually is going on? What networks? What areas of the brain? How does this relate to their not being able to speak or speaking? And how do we change that, right? So we're not just saying, does anybody, tell you what's happening in the brain? If you read the paper, you're going to understand it. As you go through this course, you're going to understand it better than anybody. And this was the first paper we published on looking at QEEG in autism. It's published in the Journal of Autism and Developmental Disorders, which is the #1 journal in the world for autism. It's, used as a real landmark, especially in the QEEG world, because it's one of the most advanced papers written on that. And this really formed the basis of looking at, functional connectivity in autism and how that relates to treatment, and basically the foundation of my doctoral program, which I've been doing over the past 3-4 years. This was a paper that we looked at our brain balance data, and we had over 2,000 children. So it's the largest study ever published, looking at primitive reflexes and looking at the relationship between, how many of the kids that we looked at had retained reflexes, all of them, to what degree, though. And the more severe they were retained, the more reflexes they had, the more that translated into academic performance and behavioral issues. So they were more delayed in academics, and we've measured that. And then we treated them, and then looked at changing the reflexes. And in this model, we just use primitive reflex exercises, which you're going to learn is not actually the most efficient way to do it, but obviously it works. And we showed that as we changed those reflexes, there was a direct change in their behavior, but there was also a change in their academics, and they got better grades. So there was a direct relation to these retained reflexes and their performance. And again, this was a large study. This is a paper that, again, we'll talk about next time my son Ty will come in. He wrote this paper with me along with the rest of our team, but he did a lot of work on it. And this is the paper that really talks about, evolution of asymmetry in the brain. Talks about, the evolution of a dominance profile. Why do we have that? What's there? What's the evolutionary basis of it? And how does that relate to issues like autism? And, why it's so important that the human brain is asymmetric. This is a paper that, again, one of the best papers. Peter Schreier has, been with me and been part of what we do for a long time. And he's, really good feedback for me. He's interesting because he grew up basically as a dyslexic kid, but yet he reads a lot. But he reads in, he's very good at just reading certain things and picking it out. And he's a really good critic from a standpoint of papers. And he said to me that he thought this was, when this paper came out, the best paper we'd ever written. Again, on the neuroanatomy of ADHD, really detailed, but practical. And again, this is when you say to somebody, we understand what is actually happening in the brain. And not just to know the neuroanatomy, but because the neuroanatomy is what you're going to change, right? You're going to target it. You're going to look at specific areas of the brain. This paper is the paper that I talked about that is the most recent paper, which I think is really even better. And this paper is about looking at autism and, again, the actual functional connectivity of networks, the importance of what we call interoception, feeling our body, becoming embodied, becoming connected to our body, and how that really forms the foundation of cognition, especially in the right hemisphere. And the reason why some kids don't speak, right? Why can't a child with autism speak? Their language centers are better than ours. So why can't they speak? What is the actual issue? And how do we change that? To me, that is when we see that evolution in our office, when we see them speaking or when they start to communicate or using a letterboard as a bridge there, it's unbelievably rewarding because you're getting a window into someone who knows everything but can't show you anything. It's kind of like they're trapped there. So this paper explains that. The next few papers that are coming out over the next couple of months are all based on original experimental data. So all of those papers were building the model, right? One of them, obviously, the large one was on data. But this is really pure experimental data. We took 60 patients, and they were individually examined by 3 examiners, one of them being me, blinded, and all had to agree on the primitive reflexes were there and what level they were there. This was for children, adolescents, and adults. Why did we do that? One, because, first of all, the controversy around primitive reflexes is that they never retain beyond year 1, right? Which kind of ridiculous anyway. What always goes right 100% of the time in humans and in their body, right? Nothing. So the idea that primitive reflexes never go away doesn't make sense, but yet that's what traditional pediatrics and pediatric neurology will tell you and are taught. So we wanted to prove, they're primitive reflexes in adults, in adolescents, and in kids beyond 1. And if they don't go away at 1, they never go away. So we showed that, we had different subjects there, 20 children, 20 adolescents, 20 adults with autism, and also all having primitive reflexes. We did QEEG at a very advanced level and looking at functional connectivity. And we also did, a few of them, we did fMRI. And then we did a battery of neuropsychological tests and academic achievement testing. And we did 12 weeks. And all we did was we trained the parent to use a brush to stimulate the reflexes and gave them a TENS unit for tactile stimulation to the right brain. That's it. And then we followed up after 12 weeks and we did everything over. This paper in particular is going to come out first, and it's looking at the QEEG data. What actually happened, imaging-wise in the brain. And what we showed was significant changes, positive changes. We'll talk in more detail about it. Changes in functional connectivity in the brain. The next paper that's going to come out after that is going to be related to what happened to the neuropsych data, right? How did that change? And that changed significantly as well. Then we have another paper that's going to come out and say, okay, what happened with the reflexes? Did they get better? Did they get worse? What happened with their movement? And then we have another paper that's going to kind of tie all of that together. And then we have another paper that's going to come out on heart rate variability. So on all of these subjects, we also looked at their heart rate variability in really a very sophisticated way. Why is that important? Because that is the window into the sympathetic and parasympathetic system. And when you can change that and document that you can change that, it's huge on every level for the immune system. You're not changing the immune system if you're not changing heart rate variability. You're not changing the brainstem. And you can't change the brainstem if you have retained reflexes. So they are all related. And we proved that we can change heart rate variability. So these next 2 papers will be on that. When we look at, the market, let's say, or the model, it's huge and it's growing faster than any other segment of healthcare. ADHD, anxiety problems, behavior problems, depression are the most commonly diagnosed mental disorders in children. Age 3 to 17 in 2016, ADHD is approximately 10%, anxiety approximately 10%. Behavior problems, 9-10%. Depression, 4%. Mental behavioral developmental disorders, 1 in 6, but actually now it's really more 1 in 5. So we're looking at about 1 in 5 children are diagnosed with some sort of severe mental health issue. So in psychology today, beginning of this year, there was an MIT researcher that actually, Stephanie Sennett, that actually said that by 2025, half of all U.S. children will be autistic, based on her tracking data. I mean, just think about that. Is that true? Is that actually going to happen? Who knows? We're pretty close, because right now we're looking at 1 in 36 and 1 in 20-something boys, right? So that's the most recent data. 4 million babies are born in the United States each year. That means that 2 million of those will be autistic if it's 50%. If current percentages hold, 40% would be intellectually disabled, which they're actually not, right? The idea that they're actually intellectually disabled and that their cognition is affected is not actually the case when you can actually get them to start to communicate. They're geniuses. Every single one of them is a genius with their left brain. There are some children, and we'll talk about, that are diagnosed with autism, but they have genetic disorders. There's 2 different main subsets of autism. One is called syndromic, the other is non-syndromic. We'll talk about the differences. The ones that are actually syndromic and genetic, they can be very, very severely mentally disabled. And they really, I don't look at that as true autism. I look at that as a genetic disorder with some autistic-like behavior. But when you're talking about true autism, where there is no genetic mutation, no brain injury, there really is no intellectual disability if you can get them to do better. 400,000 would be completely non-speaking, non-verbal. By the way, in the autism world, non-speaking is now the preferred way of saying it. Actually, it's easy because non-verbal, when we talk about non-verbal communication, it makes it a little bit more clear when we're talking about that they can't speak. Journal of American Medical Association just reported that the lifetime cost of caring with an individual raises from 1.4 to 2.4 million. So, an epidemic of this magnitude would be unsustainable at every level. But what is anybody doing about it? What's going to actually happen with these kids? We have worked over the past 6-7 months or so in a school for autism, working with these kids, and every kid in there is diagnosed with autism, all different age groups. And we put my method in there as a pilot to be able to work with these kids, to be able to do something. Because if you go and you look, what's happening, you have OTs, you have PTs, you have, speech therapists, and they're trying, right? They're doing ABA mostly, applied behavioral analysis. But if you're there and you go in and you actually observe, it's really glorified babysitting. What do these kids need more than anything else is they need to be educated. They need to be able to actually learn in school. And they are brilliant, right? But the problem is that they're so impaired sensorially and motorically on the right side of the brain especially. They're so disconnected from their body. They can't move their body in ways that are purposeful. They can't just point to something. If you say point to, what you know, they may point here, or they may just go into some sort of stim. They can't speak. The most complex motor act that's ever been achieved on this planet is verbal speech. Standing upright is number 2. But speech, it's really hard. It's very complicated. Everything needs to be in order for you to do that. Even if your language center is perfect and all the words are there, can't speak. So these are huge issues. And like I said, when you look at, just over 20% of children currently at some point during their life are going to have a serious debilitating mental disorder. 20%. That's pretty high. But what's interesting is it's 20% of adults, too. So are we looking at a different population or the same population? I would argue that most of the time, the adult mental health issues started in childhood. And I think that's being more and more recognized in the psychiatric and psychological world, that, these things start developmentally all the time. Not just part of the time, but almost all the time. But they have no tools of what to do about it, right? What are they going to do? Early screening, early warning. We have this mixed message where they're telling us that the milestones are delayed and they don't matter, but we need to identify things early. Okay. How are you going to do that when you already changed, the way you're going to actually do it? And what are you recognizing anyway? What are you going to do? So we can medicate the crap out of little kids? Or are you going to change it, right? So when you're dealing with adults and you talk to them, and you should always talk to them about their mental health, right? Even if what you do is primarily, getting rid of their pain or whatever. And you need to also talk to them about their history. When did it start? What were you like as a kid? Did you have chronic digestive issues? Did you have eczema as a child? Do you have chronic infections? And, we're going to show you a lot of different videos of the histories that I do with people around the world. And it's fascinating, to hear. And many of them are really high functioning. And that's another thing to always remember, that what I say to parents and patients is that, again, the why. Why is this happening to this child? Why not my other children? Why did it happen to me and not my brother or my sister, right? Because you're unusually gifted. You have areas of your brain that start out stronger than most people. And that's the foundation of it. It doesn't come from a deficit. It doesn't come from, from lack. For the most part, it comes from they're too good, right? Areas of the brain are too strong, and they're holding back these other areas of the brain because of that. Somehow this imbalance developed, and once it's there, it's not going away on its own. It's going to get worse. And your goal is to go back and say, where did this happen? How do I change it? At any age. Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, meaning that the way that we look at child development, the story of brain development from the very beginning, especially in that first year, we're looking at evolution, right? We're looking at a recapitulation of all of the evolutionary motor forms that formed on this planet. From just wiggling to rolling over on the belly like a snake, crawling, getting on all fours like quadrupeds, getting up and walking kind of like knuckle walkers, and then eventually standing up and walk, which only humans have done. Or humanoids, right? Hominids, all the different species. And the defining thing between our species and the other hominid species is how much we stood up, right? The more we achieved a fully erect position. And we can see it in the fossil records. And that's it, right? So that movement is really important. And in neuroscience, there's a statement that simple movement, simple brain. Complex movement, complex brain. Most complex movement that's ever been achieved is bipedalism. It's really hard to do it. And it takes perfect synchrony. There's a timing to it. So gross motor milestones, this is a paper from the Journal of Pediatrics. Okay? So this is the journal from the American Medical Association Pediatrics, level. And this is just 2016. And what are they saying? Basically, they're looking at longitudinal association of age and achieving gross motor milestones and children's development in the US, and looking at, individuals and looking at twins. So basically, we're going to look at these kids and say, how did their early milestones and movement and walking and gross motor development, how did that translate years down the road? And the study provides evidence that the age of achieving motor milestones may be an important basis for various aspects of later child development. in twin key predictors of later development, example, prenatal factors, overshadow the predictive milestones in infancy. Now, the reference on the bottom is from our paper on basal ganglia, which is one of the best papers, again, that we've written. I didn't give it to you this time, but, oh no, I did give it to you this time in the folder. But that paper is, when you look at papers, how do you know if it's a good paper or not a good paper? Well, there's something called an impact factor, meaning what kind of impact does it make? How do we measure impact? We measure that by how many people read it and also how many people refer to it in their work. This paper, by far, out of all the papers we've written, which I'm up to now probably, I think, 70 or 80, has been referenced more than any other paper, like 60,000 times. That's a big deal, right? And so in this paper, in June of 2016, they're saying how important milestones are. And, we see also looking at the way things should develop, right? They're even talking about, okay, this is how we move with balance, with locomotor skills, running, jumping, galloping, hopping, skipping, things that should happen. Feet shoulder width apart, feet together, being able to do 1 foot with eyes open. So looking at the importance of this, and we know that in something like autism, that there's a deviation of normal motor development. And this is the paper I'm talking about on looking at the development of the basal ganglia. And this is such a hugely important, this network from cerebellum, thalamus, prefrontal cortex, basal ganglia, and especially looking at that loop between the prefrontal cortex, basal ganglia, and thalamus is that's human behavior. Again, one of the most fascinating questions is, why does somebody do what they do? Right? Why do you do what you do? A lot of this is going to be self-exploration in this course. We're going to be having you do a lot of testing on yourself, and you should know everything about your own brain. Most people never will, but you need to. And so, this interaction is one of the most important things you're going to learn. This looks at the impact of maternal gestation stress on motor development in late childhood. And this is looking at maternal stress and how it may impact motor development. So we look at where does this all start? This is a paper by a guy named John Constantino. He's one of the top researchers in autism. And in this paper, what he did was he looked at autism and looked at siblings of kids with autism and wanted to look at what was the marker, what was the thing that could distinguish a kid with autism from their brother or sister who doesn't have autism, right? What was it? What was the most unique feature? Was it anything about their environment? Did they exposed to different things? And none of that really mattered. The main thing he found was their motor development. The way they proceeded in early motor development was the difference between a kid being autistic and not being autistic, right? So there are factors, obviously, that underlie why that child didn't move in the same way, why they didn't go through those milestones. But again, it matters so much that in this paper he argues that abnormal motor development should be a key diagnostic feature of autism. There's basically, 4 that you look at now, and we'll talk about all of that. But he's saying that abnormal motor development should be one of those features because it is consistently the thing. But again, he doesn't have a solution for it. What do we do? Okay, that's what you're going to have, the best solution to say, okay, this is what we do. Again, this is another paper on that, gross motor milestones, subsequent development. And a lot of the key to movement is synchronicity, coordination. And this translates into the coordination and networks in the brain, the different frequencies of how the brain actually speaks, which is related to the frequency of firing of neurons in the spinal cord that are generated by movement. and by sway and just by, standing up against gravity. So understanding that, when we look at things like autism, epilepsy, schizophrenia, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, they're all associated with abnormal neural synchronization. And the correlation between abnormalities in neural synchronization and cognitive dysfunction emphasize the importance of temporal coordination. What does that mean? It means we need to change the coordination of someone's motor movements. That we literally change that. We train that. But you can't do that if you have retained reflexes. So you can't do that if you have asymmetry of muscle tone. So it starts with the brain and the nervous system. And again, the progression of development. This is the most recent CDC take on milestones that came out post-COVID. So rolling from tummy to back, we always would say 3 to 5 months. No, it's 6 months now. Sits without support. We would say 6 months. They're now 9 months. Crawling. Used to say at 8 to 10 months a child should crawl. Now it's not even a milestone. Doesn't matter. They don't need to crawl. What? Like, that's crazy. What are you talking about? What's the rationale for that? The rationale is, I saw a psychologist who wrote an article on this, and he said, well, more than 50% of kids don't crawl in a typical way anymore. So therefore, normal crawling is not normal. If you look at a bell curve, what we call a normal distribution curve, right? Statistically, he's right. That normal crawling is not normal anymore. Because now, the majority of kids don't crawl in a typical way. They don't get up and do these steps and crawl on all fours. They'll drag a leg, or they hop on their butt, or they, hop like a rabbit, or they roll on the ground. And it can look cute. You look at Instagram, and you'll see videos of really funny music with kids like hopping and rolling and on their butts, scooting along, and it looks cute, but it's not the way it's supposed to happen. But most kids are doing that now. Now, okay, you use that as your rationale, but what happens to those kids, right? We also see an epidemic of all of these issues. And we see an epidemic rise in mental health issues in adults. I mean, think about mental health issues right now in this country, right? All of the shootings that are going on. I've done studies on this and gone back to Columbine. And virtually all these shootings, for the most part, if you go back, they have issues that relate to what we do. I had one young lady that was going to chiropractic school years ago, took my course like this. She was so motivated, she wanted to go back and get a PhD in neuroscience. She went to the University of Texas, and she also happened to be working in one of my brain balance centers down in Texas in Austin. And there was a shooting down in the University of Texas a couple of years ago. And she literally called me up, and she said, I'm sitting here on the campus, the site where this actually happened. And I'm thinking, and we had this kid that would come into our center every day, 8 years old. Every day he would come in and go, I'm going to kill everybody in my class. I hate them. I'm going to take a gun and I'm going to shoot them all. That's what he would say every day, right? Work with him for a few months. She said, this kid is the sweetest kid you ever want to know. He would never say anything like that again. He's a totally different kid. He's happy. He comes in, he's laughing, and hugs you and all of that. And she said, I can't help but think that we stopped someone from doing this down the road. That this kid would have gone in at some point and probably killed people. And why? Right? He had a great family. Why? Because his brain development didn't go the way it was supposed to. And it would never change on his own, but we changed it and changed the trajectory of his life and maybe the life of many other people that, he might have gone in and actually taken a gun and shot people. Pretty powerful to think about that. So again, it all really starts with development of the brain. We have to understand that development is the key and become an expert in that. And that's what we're going to do. But I'm going to give you a break right now for 15 minutes.